Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Briarwood Lake had the sort of hush that felt like a held breath. It was a place where the map could be folded small and carried in the pocket of a coat, and everyone's front porch remembered the footprints of those who stopped by. The town lay cradled in a ring of pines that kept secrets in their needles and let the sunlight sift through in long lazy streaks each morning. Houses were spaced like thoughtful pauses in a conversation, and the roads wound as if not to hurry anyone along. Elena Harper's home sat on a little rise that leaned toward the water, a weathered house with paint the color of old milk and a porch swing that knew the rhythm of her afternoons. People in Briarwood Lake spoke softly about storms and weddings, about the price of bread and who had mended whose fence, and their voices traveled like gentle ripples. Even gossip here felt embarrassed to be loud. Elena moved through her days with the kind of quiet that was not absence but presence, a woman who listened for the small things other folk missed. The way a neighbor's laugh trailed off, the hesitation in a child's answer, the particular tilt of Mark's head when a thought had fled him. Her hands were steady from years of kneading dough and repairing hems, habits that kept her grounded. She loved the lake as one loves a familiar song. The water's surface held light in the same way her memory held kindnesses. The town's clock tower chimed the hours like a faithful metronome, and people set their lives to its cadence. On Sundays, neighbors in shoes that had seen many seasons would pass greetings on the church steps. The world felt right side up in Briarwood Lake, not because it was without trouble, but because troubles felt smaller here, carried and softened by neighbors who knew when to step in and when to let someone be. Elena's days, like the town, were stitched with routine. The same coffee cup in the same place, the same route to the market where the grocer nodded as if they were both keeping a shared secret. The same small rituals that made up the scaffolding of a life. It was precisely this steady simplicity that made the first fishers all the more jarring. When something that had always been solid begins to chip, you notice the hairline cracks the way one notices the first thin ice on a pond. Nothing about Elena's life screamed for drama. She preferred to live with a slow hand and a deliberate heart, feeling each choice as if it were the turning of a page in a beloved book. People in town liked her for it. She had the rare quality of making anyone she spoke with feel like the only person in the room, so when the air around her household began to change, eyes that had once watched only for weather began to notice the subtle shifts in her everyday weather. The way Mark lingered at the edge of the doorway, the way he left the chair warm as if he had only just risen, and then was gone a little while longer than before. All of these were barely more than whispers at first, like leaves rustling out of season. But even a whisper can sound like thunder if you listen long enough. Elena felt the change not with the trumpet of accusation, but with the fine, steady ache of someone attentive to detail. She knew Mark better than anyone, which is another way of saying she knew the small constellations of his being. The curve of his smile when a joke landed, the way he read a map with his lips pursed, the steadiness of his voice when he surrendered to sleep. Recently, those constellations had shifted. Stars moved from their familiar places, and the outlines she had relied on seemed to blur at the edges. He would return from town with his hat pressed deep and his brow drawn as if he were carrying a weight he could not name. Sometimes he would stand on the back porch and stare not at the lake, but at the far side of the ridge as if searching for something he had misplaced. He gave explanations that fit like shoes a size too small, functional enough to get him where he needed to go, but pinching where it mattered. Elena watched without accusation, because accusation breeds shame, and she would not make a bedroom into a battlefield. Instead, she folded herself into prayer, a practice that had never felt pious to her but rather practical, like returning to a well for water. At night, she would kneel beside her bed the way one kneels before a difficult decision, palms pressed together, and ask for wisdom. If any of you lacks wisdom, she would whisper, remembering the counsel of James 1 verse 5, let him ask of God. The words were not a litany but a lifeline, and she clung to them. Prayer for Alana was like tuning an instrument. It did not manufacture miracles on a schedule, but it clarified the notes until the music was discernible again. She allowed herself to hope but not to demand, to watch but not to pounce. The strength of her restraint surprised some who knew her as gentle. There is a power in patience that the world often mistakes for weakness. She understood, because she had learned to read the small things, that storms announce themselves before they break, that birds fall silent before thunder. And so she prepared herself not by noise but by steadiness, anchoring her heart with quiet petitions and the slow, deliberate tending of her household. Lydia Collins arrived in town the way certain storms do, sudden, charismatic, and marked by a scent that lingered afterward. She wore her confidence like a coat, tailored and sharp, and she spoke in a voice that seemed to make people sit up straighter. As though attention were a currency she spent freely. Lydia had the knack of making a room feel brighter when she entered and colder when she left. She could smooth a conversation like butter on warm bread, and then leave knives hidden in empty compliments. She started as a helpful presence, bringing a pie to the church social, offering to water a neighbor's plants while they were away, small gestures that lodged like hooks in the memory of the townsfolk. But beneath the charm was a hunger that was thinly veiled, the sort that measures people not by their humanity but by what they can be made to give. Lydia found ways to be the person Mark would notice, a shared interest in the same rare records, a laugh time just where it would be heard, a story that aligned like a mirror with an insecurity she had noticed in passing. She painted Elena in tones she herself chose, nervous, suspicious, hard to understand, and it is astonishing how quickly words, once released, start to look like truth if they keep being spoken. Lydia did not set out to be cruel in the first hour. Cruelty is often an art practiced over time, but she had learned that a well-placed whisper can become a drumbeat. She told tales that had the gloss of truth because they were threaded with detail and punctuated with mimicry of Elena's habits. To anyone listening from outside, these stories held a certain plausibility, and plausibility can be more persuasive than fact because it asks less of the listener. Lydia's method was simple. Make the other woman appear unsteady enough that pity would be the replacement emotion. Make yourself the bridge for that pity to cross. While Lydia wove, Elena's friends, Sarah Bennett, whose hands had soothed more skinned knees than anyone's, Grace O'Neill, who had a laugh that could pull sunshine into the gloomiest room, and Miriam Carter, who remembered everyone's birthdays and the way their mothers liked their coffee, watched. They watched not with the hasty mobilization of gossip, but with the deliberate observance of those committed to truth. They did not jump immediately to confrontation. A true friend knows the difference between an ember and an inferno, and they were not ready to pour water on something that might be nothing. Their silence was not complicity but calculation, a slow preparation to protect a woman they loved. The first signs Lydia's words were not the whole story came in small, almost ridiculous ways. A phrase in Lydia's story that didn't match Mark's speech, a detail about Elena's habits that made no sense to anyone who had ever shared a summer pie with her. Sarah noticed these tilting details first and mentioned them casually to Grace one afternoon while they shelved hymnals at the church. Grace, who kept an inventory of kindnesses and grudges in equal measure, recalled a moment when Lydia's smile had been 2 beats too long. Miriam, who taught Sunday school and listened to children's unfiltered truths, had observed Lydia saying the same phrase in different ways to different people, an adaptation that set Miriam's mind to work. The trio began to compare notes the way farmers measure rainfall carefully over time. They watched as Lydia's visits to Mark coincided with an odd new distance in his eyes, and they watched as Lydia laughed with just enough shine to make someone feel chosen. None of them wanted to be the one to fan flames of suspicion without cause. They also did not want to wait until suspicion had hardened into belief. They moved as friends do when the stakes are private and high, quietly, deliberately, and with a faith that truth, if patient, would reveal itself. Each woman in that circle had her own interior life of prayers and promises. They lifted Elena in whispered petitions behind closed doors the way people might whisper a name over a warm lamp, trusting that the act of speaking it aloud made it more likely to be guarded. Their plan was not a plan of exposure but of protection, to be ready like steady oars should the water grow rough. As the sun slid behind the pines and the lake turned to a sheet of pewter, Elena sat in the hush of evening, feeling a tremor she could not yet name, unaware that friends were aligning like constellations to keep watch until truth found its way back to shore. Mark never realized how dramatically Lydia's lies were beginning to coil around his thoughts, until were already shaping the way he interpreted even the smallest details of his day. What began as brief whispered remarks presented with a sigh or a sympathetic tilt of her head slowly thickened into elaborate stories that carried the weight of false concern. Lydia spoke with the kind of certainty that made doubt feel impolite, as though questioning her would be an offense against some delicate truth she alone had the privilege to carry. She would catch Mark alone in the hallway after Sunday service or find him along the road as he loaded supplies into his truck, and she always approached with a softness that masked the sharp intention beneath. She would say things like, "I'm only mentioning this because I care," or "I didn't think I should tell anyone else," shaping her lies in a way that suggested secrecy was an act of kindness. Over time, her fabrications grew bolder, embroidered with details intentionally crafted to irritate Mark's trust. She claimed Elena had stood outside the market muttering to herself, or that she had seen her wandering aimlessly along the ridge as if she didn't know where she was. Lydia described these moments with such flair, her gestures sweeping through the air, her expressions shifting like a performer, that Mark found himself imagining Elena in those scenes, even though they contradicted everything he knew about her steadiness. The unspoken implication behind Lydia's words was always the same. Elena was unraveling, and Mark needed someone to speak plainly about it. These insinuations pressed on Mark throughout his days like a stone in his shoe, never enough to cripple his steps, yet persistent enough to alter his stride. He found himself scrutinizing Elena's moods more closely, analyzing every pause in her speech or every moment she appeared lost in thought. Lydia had planted her stories like weeds in unguarded soil, and though Mark never fully accepted them, he allowed them to sprout just enough for discomfort to grow. Lydia's lies became a quiet secondary voice in his head, whispering interpretations he would not have otherwise considered. When Elena paused before answering a question, Lydia's voice suggested she was hiding something. When Elena looked tired after a long day, Lydia's voice suggested emotional instability. When Elena prayed quietly at night, Lydia's voice suggested fear masquerading as devotion. The poison worked slowly, but it worked. Lydia did not attack Elena's character directly. She subtly chipped away at Mark's perception, feeding him narratives that diluted his certainty. What made Lydia dangerous was not the intensity of her lies, but the gentleness with which she served them. The soft, almost maternal concern she expressed made the lies feel like warnings instead of betrayals. And Mark, weighed down by work, fatigue, and his desire to believe the best in people, didn't see how thoroughly he was being manipulated. The effect on the household was gradual but undeniable. Elena sensed him becoming less anchored in the small rhythms they once shared. His smiles felt thinner, his attentiveness wandered. He asked questions that didn't sound like his own voice, and though he tried to behave normally, She could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere between them, like the barometric pressure before an approaching storm. Lydia's web was still invisible to Mark, but its threads were tightening around him, and he was beginning to mistake their tightening for his own intuition. That was the frightening part. Lydia blurred the line between her inventions and Mark's own reasoning so delicately that he felt his uncertainty was self-generated, and as the lies grew more elaborate, as Lydia added gestures of false pity and dramatic sighs to her tales, Mark found himself drifting further from the woman who prayed faithfully for him every night. But even as Lydia pulled at the seams of their peace, the deeper truth, though quiet, had not yet surrendered. Something in Mark's spirit resisted completely accepting the lies. It sat like a pebble under the current of Lydia's stories, a reminder that Elena's character had always been consistent. This inner contradiction, though faint, kept him from stepping fully into deception, and in time that small resistance would become the opening through which truth would find its way back into his heart. Elena had begun noticing the distance forming between them not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through subtleties that only someone who had loved deeply and attentively could observe. Mark's voice, once warm even in exhaustion, now carried an invisible stiffness, as though every response required a moment of internal translation. His eyes lingered less on her face when she spoke, drifting instead toward objects that had nothing to do with their conversation: a cup on the counter, a coat on the chair, the window that faced the lake. Elena never clung to him or demanded explanations. She believed love required space, not surveillance. Yet she felt a slow erosion between them, a thinning of the invisible thread that had always connected their hearts. She sensed he was wrestling with something unspoken, something he himself did not yet fully understand, and she refused to meet uncertainty with fear. Instead, she leaned more deeply into prayer, not as a performance of faith, but as an instinctive reaching toward the one who had steadied her through every season of her life. Her prayers were not cries for vengeance or pleas for proof. They were quiet offerings of trust. She whispered, "Lord, guide my heart, and sometimes strengthen me for what I cannot yet see." It wasn't that she expected immediate answers. Prayer for Elena was not transactional. It was like lighting a lantern in a dark hallway, not bright enough to reveal the whole path, but sufficient to take the next gentle step. She prayed before dawn when the world was soft with mist, and again before bed when the house felt too quiet. Each prayer rooted her in peace that did not depend on Mark's mood or Lydia's lies. She prayed because she believed that stillness could fight battles more effectively than fury. She prayed because she trusted that God could do in the unseen what she could not accomplish with words. Yet even as she held on to this anchor, she felt sorrow rising in small waves, sorrow not for herself alone, but for Mark, who seemed increasingly carried by a current without realizing he had stepped into it. She began to watch him not from suspicion but from compassion. She noted the tension in his shoulders when he returned home, the way he hesitated before meeting her eyes, the restless tapping of his foot, as though trying to shake loose a thought he couldn't grasp. Sometimes he would open his mouth to speak but then close it again, as if the words had dissolved before reaching his tongue. Each moment felt like another page being torn quietly from a book they had written together. Elena tried to hold the torn edges gently rather than lashing out at the loss. When Mark asked distant questions about her day, about where she had gone, about who she had spoken with, she answered softly, knowing the questions did not come from mistrust, but from confusion planted by someone else. She sensed she was no longer simply talking to her husband. She was talking through a fog someone else had drawn around him. That realization deepened her prayers, shaping them into a shield. And though she could not yet see the source of the fog, she felt in her spirit that truth would eventually surface. She believed it the way a person believes dawn will follow night, because she knew God did not abandon those who came to him in sincerity. She held to Psalm 18 verse 2, whispering it in the quiet corners of her day. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. These words did not change her circumstances, but they changed her posture within them. They made her steady. They made her patient. They made her brave. And though she sensed the storm building, she was already preparing her heart for the moment she would have to stand firmly in truth while the winds of deception blew around her. Sarah Bennet had never been a woman easily fooled by surface charm. She had learned long ago, through heartaches, through friendships that blossomed and rotted, through seasons of caring for others, that genuineness had a particular sound. It rang clean like metal struck against stone. Lydia's presence, though pretty on the outside, produced an off-key note in Sarah's instincts from the very first week. She did not rush to judgment, she simply watched. She watched the way Lydia's eyes flicker around a room, assessing which listener would be the easiest to influence. She watched how Lydia adjusted her tone depending on who stood beside her, soft for some, bold for others, always shifting like a performer changing costumes between acts. Grace O'Neill picked up on different things. She noticed Lydia's inconsistent stories, the way details were embellished when convenient and discarded when challenged. Grace had a sharp ear for contradiction because she disliked dishonesty with a passion. To her, truth was a stable structure, and anything unstable made her pay attention. Miriam Carter, tender-hearted but perceptive, sensed Lydia's duplicity in even subtler ways, like the way Lydia's smile froze for a second too long after someone complimented her, or the way she inserted herself into conversations not to contribute but to redirect attention toward herself. These three women, each perceptive in their own right, began to share quiet glances that acknowledged their shared unease. They never gossiped about Lydia. They observed her the way gardeners observe an unfamiliar plant, curious but cautious, unsure whether it would produce fruit or thorns. As Lydia's lies about Elena began to surface in strange pockets of conversation around town, whispers at the bakery, comments at the post office, murmurs during community meetings, Sarah, Grace, and Miriam grew more certain that something was wrong. But they did not rush to Elena immediately, not because they doubted her, but because they understood the weight of what they were witnessing. False rumors, when mishandled, can shred relationships beyond repair. They needed to be sure before intervening. So they watched Lydia with the patience of women accustomed to protecting those they love. They noticed how she lingered around Mark with the calculated ease of someone who wanted to be seen as a confidante. They noticed how she timed her departures so she could be spotted walking in the same direction Mark had taken minutes earlier. They noticed the way she spoke Elena's name, softly as though cloaked in concern, but with a glint of satisfaction in her eyes that betrayed her intentions. Sarah once overheard Lydia casually claiming Elena had snapped at someone at the market, a lie so absurd Sarah's jaw tightened. She did not confront her. She simply stored the lie away like evidence in a quiet trial they had all begun conducting in their hearts. Grace noted that Lydia often exaggerated Elena's supposed behavior with dramatic gestures, a habit people usually employ when facts are lacking. Miriam, who believed deeply in the power of prayer, began praying for clarity, for protection over Elena, and even reluctantly for truth to touch Lydia's heart. Together, without planning it, the three women became unseen guardians of Elena's reputation, catching lies as they drifted through the town and holding them up to the light to see where they originated. And though none of them had yet spoken directly to Elena about what was happening, a bond was forming, a quiet, vigilant fellowship that would soon play a pivotal role in unraveling the web Lydia had built. In a town where everyone believed they understood everyone else, these three friends were learning that truth required more than familiarity. It required intentional watching, patient judgment, and the courage to act at the right moment. As the days moved forward and Lydia's manipulations grew bolder, Elena's friends began noticing that the pattern of deception was not random, it was strategic. Lydia targeted moments when Elena was not present. She inserted doubts during gatherings where people were distracted. She planted subtle concerns in conversations where listeners were unlikely to question her motives. Yet what Lydia could not calculate was the natural loyalty that existed among those who had known Elena for years. Women who had prayed beside her, shared meals with her, sat on porches with her during summer evenings, and held her hand through grief and joy. When Sarah finally approached Grace and Miriam one afternoon, standing outside the church as crisp leaves scraped across the walkway, her voice carried an urgency that had matured over weeks of quiet observation. "Something isn't right," she said, and though the words were simple, they broke the silence that had held them all in cautious restraint. Grace nodded, her jaw tight. She confessed she had heard Lydia making strange insinuations about Elena's emotional stability and had dismissed them at first as thoughtless remarks. Miriam, gentle but firm, admitted she had sensed a spiritual heaviness around Lydia, an unsettling shadow that felt out of place in the warmth of Briarwood Lake. Together the three women formed an unspoken pact. They would protect Elena not through confrontation or gossip, but through clarity, presence, and prayer. They began piecing together the inconsistencies in Lydia's stories, comparing timelines, recalling conversations, and noticing how Lydia always portrayed herself as the reluctant truth-teller forced into revealing Elena's supposed flaws. The more they examined, the clearer the pattern became. Lydia was orchestrating a narrative designed to isolate Elena and draw Mark closer to herself. This realization strengthened their resolve. They decided they would speak to Elena only when the time was right, when the truth was undeniable, and when speaking would heal rather than harm. Until then, they watched Lydia with the unwavering vigilance of shepherds guarding their flock against a concealed predator. Meanwhile, Elena remained unaware of the extent of the defense being mounted on her behalf. She spent her evenings by the lake, her hands resting in her lap, praying for direction without knowing that God was already moving through her friends' hearts. She prayed not for exposure of wrongdoing, but for peace, for wisdom, and for her marriage to regain its footing. Her prayers floated across the quiet surface of the lake like small boats carrying hope under a starless sky. And while Elena prayed for what she could not see, Sarah, Grace, and Miriam prepared for the moment they knew was coming, the moment when truth would need to be spoken plainly, when Mark's confusion would need to be met with clarity, and when Lydia's web would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. For now they waited, attentive and ready, trusting that truth, though slow in its steps, never arrives late. Elena waited until the evening carried the soft hush that belonged only to Briarwood Lake, an hour when the world seemed to dim its noise so hearts could speak without interruption. She invited Mark onto the back porch with a warmth that carried no accusation, no edge, no trace of bitterness, just a gentle steadiness that came from days of quiet prayer. The porch boards beneath their feet felt cool, the lake shimmered faintly in the dying light, and a faint breeze whispered through the pine branches, brushing against them like a reminder that the world continued to move even when hearts felt stuck. Mark hesitated before sitting, unsure of what words were waiting for him, unsure of how much truth he himself was ready to face. Elena watched him not with suspicion, but with the compassion of someone who understood the weight of inner battles. She folded her hands loosely in her lap and let silence rest between them long enough to soften the edges of his anxieties. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and unwavering. "Mark, I want you to tell me what your heart has been carrying." Those simple words disarmed him more than any accusation could have. She did not demand explanations. She did not dissect his behavior. She simply created a space wide enough for truth to breathe. Mark swallowed hard, eyes fixed on distant place across the water, as though he might find answers written in the ripples. He confessed that he felt pulled in conflicting directions, that he had been hearing stories, sensing doubts he couldn't explain, feeling as though shadows were gathering in corners he didn't know how to clear. Elena listened without interrupting, her face serene, her presence a balm to his troubled confession. When she answered, it was with a clarity born from prayer, that truth did not fear examination and that deception, no matter how cleverly disguised, always left a residue that the heart could not hide from completely. She told him she sensed he had been struggling, that she had prayed not for proof of wrongdoing, but for peace within their home. Her sincerity struck him deeply, leaving him wordless for several long moments. Elena then gently said, "You and I have built too much together to let whispers guide us. If there are questions, we walk through them together, not alone." There was no tremor in her tone, no anger, only the quiet confidence of someone anchored in faith. Mark felt something loosen inside him, something that had been tightened by weeks of Lydia's insinuations. And as the sky darkened into a deeper shade of blue, Elena closed her eyes briefly and whispered, "Lord, reveal what needs to be revealed." The prayer hung in the air like a soft, glowing lantern, illuminating not the path ahead, but the courage needed to walk it. Her calmness pressed gently against the storm that had been swirling in Mark's mind, and for the first time in weeks he felt clarity inching closer. The conversation did not solve everything in an instant, but it cracked open a doorway. Truth, once invited, had begun to move. The next morning carried an energy that felt different, as though the very air sensed that hidden things were edging closer to exposure. Sarah Bennett stepped out of her home with the determined posture of a woman who had carried truth long enough and was ready to set it down in the open. She met Grace and Miriam near the corner of Willowford Road, where the trees leaned over the path as if to shelter confidential conversations. The three women had not planned this meeting, yet each of them felt the same prompting, a quiet insistence that the time for silent observation had ended. Sarah spoke first, her voice firm but gentle, explaining the full extent of Lydia's gossip, the subtle lies, the manipulations she had witnessed. Grace added the parts she had heard during community gatherings, the contradictions Lydia had let slip, the exaggerated concerns she had voiced with faint sympathy. Miriam, with her soft but unwavering tone, spoke about the spiritual heaviness she had sensed, the uneasy feeling that truth was being twisted for personal gain. Together, their testimonies formed a tapestry too consistent to ignore. They walked toward the Harper home with heavy hearts but clear purpose. Mark was outside splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing through the yard. He glanced up when he noticed the three women approaching, and something inside him tensed, an instinct that told him this moment mattered. Sarah stepped forward, greeting him politely before asking if she could speak with him. Mark wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded, sensing gravity in her expression. What followed was a gentle but unflinching unraveling of Lydia's deception. Each woman shared what she had witnessed, carefully, without exaggeration, without melodrama, and without any desire to wound. Their voices were calm, their facts aligned, their compassion evident. Mark listened, his breathing growing heavier as every piece of their testimony chipped away at the false narrative Lydia had built around his wife. The truth, spoken by people with no incentive to manipulate, began to illuminate the lies that had once seemed plausible. Mark felt his stomach knot as the realization sank in that he had allowed seeds of doubt to take root in his heart. He thought of Elena's prayers, her calmness, her unwavering tenderness despite sensing the distance between them. Shame pressed upon him, not in a destructive way but in a sobering one. Miriam rested a gentle hand on his arm and said quietly, "Truth has a way of finding its way home, Mark. Don't let guilt swallow you, just let clarity in." Her words had the weight of grace behind them. As they finished, the three women assured him they stood with Elena, not out of bias, but out of deep lived knowledge of her character. At that moment, Mark felt a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. Lydia's words, once so convincing, now sounded hollow in his memory, like echoes from a room he should never have entered. And as he looked toward his home, toward the woman whose prayers had shielded him even when he didn't know he needed protection, he understood that the path back to truth had already opened. Lydia Collins, unaware that her carefully stitched illusions were unraveling, walked through town that day with this same confident sway she always carried, chin lifted, smile poised, eyes bright, with the satisfaction of someone who believed she still controlled the narrative. She had grown bolder with each lie, convinced that her charm shielded her from suspicion. She believed she had painted Elena into a fragile corner that only she could rescue Mark from. In her mind, she had orchestrated the perfect sequence of concerns, misunderstandings, and invented incidents. Lydia had always excelled at making fiction look like truth, and she trusted that this time her performance was flawless. But deception has a way of cracking when truth begins to approach, and what Lydia had failed to foresee was that people who truly know someone, people who have loved them, prayed with them, walked through seasons with them, cannot easily be fooled. When she spotted Mark later that afternoon, she approached with calculated softness, wearing an expression of concern so practiced it might have fooled someone else. She began another embellished tale, this one about seeing Elena looking lost near the North Ridge. But this time Mark did not smile politely or nod uncertainly. He watched her closely, noticing things he had overlooked before, the theatrical tilt of her head, the rehearsed hesitation in her voice, the way her eyes darted momentarily as she reached for details. Lydia misread his silence as encouragement and pressed on, layering her lie with greater detail. Yet the more she spoke, the more transparent she became. Her words no longer felt sympathetic, they felt staged. Her tone no longer echoed concern, it echoed intention. Mark realized that every time she described Elena, she did so with a faint hint of satisfaction, a pleasure poorly concealed behind her facade of pity. Then, mid-sentence, she slipped, offering a detail that contradicted an earlier story she had told. The inconsistency landed between them like a heavy stone. Mark's expression shifted, no longer clouded by confusion but sharpened by understanding. He asked her calmly to repeat the detail, and Lydia froze for just a second, barely enough for a less discerning observer to notice, but more than enough for Mark. Her charm cracked. For a moment her polished veneer slipped, revealing frustration and fear beneath. She attempted to repair the slip with a laugh, dismissing the inconsistency as a simple mix-up, but her voice shook slightly, betraying her. Mark's silence grew heavier, and Lydia sensed for the first time that she was losing him. She tried to redirect the conversation, but her usually fluid words stumbled. Mark simply said, "I know the truth now, Lydia," and her face drained of confidence. It was not said in anger nor accusation, but with a quiet finality that told her the game was finished. Lydia felt the shift like a door closing, and though she attempted to regain composure, the power she once held over him dissolved into the cold air around them. Deception, once exposed, loses its shine instantly. And Lydia, who had built her influence on illusions, now stood in the stark light of truth, unable to conceal her intentions any longer. That evening, Elena sat beside the lake as twilight settled, unaware that the winds of truth had finally swept through the tangled forest of deception. She sat in her usual place, hands resting loosely in her lap, listening to the rhythmic sound of water meeting the shore. It had always been a sacred place for her, a space where her thoughts untangled, where prayers rose effortlessly, where her spirit close to God. She had prayed earlier for guidance, for strength, for clarity to reach Mark's heart, and now the peace that followed lingered around her like a soft embrace. When Mark returned home, he found her there, illuminated by the fading light, looking as serene as if she had been carved from the evening itself. He approached slowly, his heart heavy with the recognition of how deeply he had allowed uncertainty to take root. He sat beside her without speaking, letting the silence settle around them like a blanket. Elena turned her head slightly, offering him a gentle smile that held no resentment, only quiet understanding. Mark took a long breath before confessing everything: the doubts he had felt, the stories he had heard, the confusion that had clouded his judgment, and the clarity he had finally received when Sarah, Grace, Miriam, and Lydia herself revealed the truth. Elena listened with the same patience she had cultivated through days of prayer, her hands folded calmly, her expression soft. She did not interrupt, did not flinch. When he finished, he whispered, "I should have come to you sooner. I should have trusted what I knew about you." Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, and said, "We heal by walking forward, not by reliving every misstep." Her forgiveness was not rushed. It was thoughtful, grounded in strength rather than naivety. Mark felt tears in his eyes as he realized how fiercely she had protected their bond, despite the storm swirling around them. Elena then closed her eyes and prayed aloud, not for revenge, not for vindication, but for restoration. "Lord, thank you for bringing truth to light. Heal our home, strengthen our steps, guard our hearts." The prayer washed over them like a soothing tide, carrying relief, gratitude, and renewed unity. When she finished, the air around them felt different, lighter, clearer, sacred. The lake, reflecting the last hints of sunset, glimmered like a promise. Mark leaned his forehead against hers, whispering apologies and gratitude, knowing he had been shielded by her faith even when he had not recognized the danger. In the weeks that followed, their home became a place of rebuilding, slow, steady, intentional. Mark worked to restore trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Elena remained strong, not because she had been untouched by hurt, but because she had allowed prayer to shape her responses rather than fear. And though Lydia faded from daily conversation and eventually from the town's attention, Elena's triumph remained evident, not in loud victories, but in the quiet, enduring strength that truth and prayer had cultivated within her. When you listen to a story like this, it reminds you that life can sometimes bring people who come with smiles on their faces, but storms in their hearts. Not everyone who praises you wants the best for you, and not everyone who calls your name is calling it with clean intentions. That is why you must guard your spirit, your home, your mind, and your relationships with wisdom. Do not let strange voices speak louder than the truth God has planted in your heart. Discernment is not suspicion, it is protection. And above all, never allow the lies of others to define your worth. When people speak falsely about you, when you feel misunderstood, when someone tries to dim your light so they can glow brighter, remember this. Truth walks slowly, but it never loses its strength. It will arrive at the perfect time. You do not need to fight every battle with your hands. Some battles are won on your knees. As you saw in Elena's journey, a praying heart cannot be defeated. Stand firm in your integrity, stay anchored in prayer, and let God fight for you. He sees every tear, every whispered prayer, every injustice. And He will always defend those who remain faithful. Now, wherever you are, relax your shoulders, breathe deeply, and join this moment of prayer. Let your heart open, let your spirit receive. Let every part of you that has been carrying weight find release. Heavenly Father, we come before you with humble hearts, thanking you for the gift of truth, the power of peace, and the strength you give to those who trust in you. Lord, for every listener hearing this prayer right now, I ask that you surround them with your divine protection. Silence every lying tongue that rises against them. Break every plan designed to destroy their peace. Let your light expose every hidden deception around their lives. Father, grant them wisdom like Elena, wisdom that sees beyond appearances, wisdom that stands firm even the heart is weary. Lord, bless every home represented by those listening. Strengthen their relationships. Fill their rooms with peace. Heal every quiet hurt. Restore every broken bond that you want to restore. And Father, teach them to pray with confidence, knowing that when they call on you, you answer. Cover them in your mercy. Clothe them in your favor. Lift them when they feel weak. Give them courage when they feel overwhelmed. Let their steps be ordered, their minds be clear, and their hearts be guarded. Anyone listening right now who feels attacked by lies, Father, fight for them. Anyone who feels betrayed, comfort them. Anyone who feels like giving up, remind them that you are not finished with their story. Strengthen their faith, deepen their discernment, and wrap them in unshakable peace. Let truth rise on their behalf, let clarity shine through darkness, and let your love calm every storm around them. And Lord, as they type amen in the comments, let it be a declaration of victory, a declaration of protection, a declaration of healing, a declaration of restored peace, a declaration that they trust you completely. In Jesus' mighty name we pray amen. If this prayer touched your spirit, type amen in the comments and let God know you receive it. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.